Here are the 6 principles that allow you to understand a chess strategy a lot easier. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, let's go ahead and get started. There was an interesting game between Carlsen playing white against Gukesh. Here Gukesh is up a queen, however the situation remains to be not that simple because these two passed pawns are moving down and they're very strong. Black has to blockade them. However, they were low on time and Carlsen decided to try out this tricky pawn sacrifice, pawn to e7. So how do you play here if you are black? Now you can take this pawn with a king, with a queen, or you can take the other one. So which move is correct? Gukesh found the correct move, king to d7, and Carlsen just resigned.
His queen between white's king and white's pawns, and e7 check was a huge blunder, and Magnus thought that Gukesh had to take e7, and then the white knight would have forked black's queen and forced a draw.
But it's interesting that both other moves, king takes e7, were incorrect because of this fork. And similarly, if Gukesh were to capture this pawn by the queen, that would also fail to the other fork. And although initially it seems like a sudden move, you can pay attention to a simple fact that a knight can only fork pieces standing on the same color, because knight always attacks squares of the same color. And if you know this idea, then picking the right move for black is pretty simple. You just need to keep your queen and king on squares of different color, and then there is no fork that even theoretically possible in a position. This time it is black to move. You may think about this as well for a second. How would you play here as black? Now this knight is hanging, so is this pawn on g7, and a lot of players would just play something like knight to g6. But knowing the idea that we talked about before, you could also use it in a more aggressive fashion. If you notice that your opponent's valuable pieces, mostly king, queen, and maybe rooks, stand on the squares of the same color, you may be on the lookout for a fork. And here black can execute it in a real spectacular fashion with bishop takes f2 sacrifice. And then, whether white captures with a king, leads to this fork, or if white instead captures by the queen, that fails to the other fork, and once again it all happens because the king and the queen are standing on the squares of the same color. There are 2 most common and therefore most important tactical motifs in chess. We've been talking about one of them so far, a fork, but the other one is a pin. In order to train yourself to actually find those pins in real games, not only in tactical puzzles, you gotta look at the patterns. And the pattern is when your opponent's valuable pieces, especially king, queen, and rooks, are standing on the same line or diagonal. And then the opportunity for a pin arises. In this position, white can manufacture it with a really stunning move, rook to a8. And of course, now this position is just a trading puzzle, but it illustrates the point really well. So why does white sacrifice the rook right here? Well, it turns out that accepting the rook sacrifice would put a king and a queen on the same diagonal, and then white can use this skewer to win the queen. Then black may be thinking, okay, then let me just move the queen elsewhere. Let's say somewhere here. But then they stand on the same rank, and now white can also skew the king and queen, this time with the rook. Finally, black can capture white's pawn, and now it looks like black is winning. However, white can persist in the same rook sacrifice, and this time, once again, the king and queen are on the same diagonal, and white can take advantage of that and win. Next idea, your knight is the strongest within this large center. Now, of course, I'm not talking about this particular position, I'm saying in general. Now, why is that so? Because within the large center, your knight turns into a real octopus. It controls 8 squares. Outside of the large center, the knight controls fewer squares and therefore becomes less active. For example, here the black knight is only controlling 6. It is white to move here. How would you play here as white? Now, white's most common move in this position is knight to e2. However, I hope that by now it's pretty clear that the correct move should be knight to f3, because your goal should be to keep your knights within this area of the large center, because you know that your knights are the strongest when they stand there, and therefore you should by all means try to keep them there as much as possible. So knight e2 violates this rule, and now after knight to g4, all of a sudden white is defenseless against this threat to the pawn on f2, and if white castles, black throws the queen out and wins the game. Now white is totally overloaded, and notice that this move queen to h4 would not be possible if white had his knight on f3, because from here the knight would simply capture the queen. But because the knight is standing passively and not doing much, black was able to develop this quick and crushing attack and win the game. Moving on to the next rule, your rook is a unique piece that you do not need to centralize, unlike any other chess piece that you have, because your rook controls 14 squares no matter what. Whether it stands here or here or here, anywhere on the board, it will still control 14 squares. And therefore you don't have to bother and waste time moving it around Plus, if you put it in the middle of the board, you will often expose it to your opponent's pawns and pieces, and therefore you can notice that strong players very often keep their rooks somewhere in the first rank and let them shoot from distance, and now you know why. Your bishop is stronger than a knight. A knight, as we know, controls only 8 squares, while a bishop controls 13. If you look at the number of squares that these pieces control, and that's how we determine a value of a chess piece, we can see that a bishop is in fact closer to a rook than to a knight. But then why do we say that these two minor pieces are still more comparable in its strength? Well, it's because there is one major drawback that a bishop has, and sometimes it plays out really badly. A bishop cannot reach squares of a particular color, and sometimes it leads to absolutely hilarious situations, such as this one. White is up a bishop and a pawn, but they cannot win the game, because the bishop simply can never control this square a8, because it's a light square, and either white goes somewhere here and stalemates black, or they just dance around and black keeps his king right there. White cannot make any progress. And that's why strong players talk about the so-called two bishops advantage. If you look at the number of squares that these pieces control, you can see that bishops are controlling 40% of the chessboard, while the knight only controls 25% of the chessboard. That's quite a difference. That's why, for example, two bishops can pretty easily checkmate a lonely king, while the knights cannot do that at all. And while bishops are stronger, this time we have no downside in having bishops, because bishops can easily attack any color on the chessboard, and therefore there is no downside anymore. That's why in such positions, when white attacks the bishop on g4, strong players playing black prefer to save the bishop and retreat it, because they do not want to trade off a bishop, they do not want to trade a bishop for a knight because the bishop is stronger, they do not want to give two bishops advantage to their opponent, but weaker opponents usually trade off because they just think that it's the easiest solution. But now, the queen and the bishop are already targeting this light square, because for lack of light square bishop, black lost the main defender of those light squares. And knowing that, you can now target those light squares, knowing that there's your big advantage that you have, because your opponent does not have a bishop, well, you do have, and so you dominate on light squares. Now bishop takes f7 is coming, if black tries to defend this, then you grab the other one, also attacking the rook, which also stands on a light square. After queen to c6, you have a bunch of ways to win, for example, bishop to b5, attacking everything on light squares, and winning the game. If you enjoyed these ideas, then you definitely are gonna love this video with Fisher's 3 rules to prevent 90% of your mistakes. You're going to get better right after watching that video, so check this out.